I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. I understand it's a difficult parking challenge. Had we known parking would be this difficult, we would have had it on campus and you'd feel right at home. In the interest of time, I'm going to cut my introduction short. I just want to say a couple of quick things. There is an exhibit in the back called Against the Odds, which is from the National Library of Medicine. It's a traveling exhibit going around the country. It arrived here today. We'll have it on display here and then in the Public Health Building for the next month or so. For those of you that are getting continuing medical education credit, this qualifies for 1 hour of CME credit. You have to fill out the right paperwork and hand it in, and there's some other disclaimers that I'm supposed to say that I forget, other than I think Dr. Friedman has no financial interest in a nuclear disaster. You know, again, to keep it short, I just want to say that you can read a lot about Dr. Friedman. His bio is on the handout that you got. There's one thing that's not there, though, which is really probably his most remarkable and impressive accomplishment. For 3 years, and think about how challenging this is. For 3 years, he successfully served as my boss and mentor. It drove him from government, but it worked out. Okay. When Mike was my boss, my mentor, my friend, I always told him that the thing he did that impressed me most, and this is true, he'll attest to this, was making really good decisions. And at the FDA, when you regulate 1/4 of all consumer spending in the U.S., it's really difficult to make good decisions, but Mike always did. And he had a strategy and a theory about how to do it. I won't get into it now, except to say that when I invited him to be a part of this lecture series, I assumed he would want to talk about cancer. He's an oncologist, one of the nation's leading cancer specialists. He spent years at the National Cancer Institute. He's now the president and CEO of City of Hope, one of the nation's premier cancer centers. But Mike said no, he wanted to talk about something else, and that was planning for a real catastrophe. And again, I realize that this is another example of Mike making a really good decision, because here's an issue that has been highly politicized, it's been highly deflected, and it remains a really, really important issue. And the question is, are we as a society, are we as a profession really prepared for this issue? So I'm looking forward to Dr. Friedman's talk. I know you join me in welcoming him here to East Tennessee.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and visit, to meet so many nice people. I know it's not politic for the person who's just been introduced to say that the remarks were absolutely accurate. As a matter of fact, the remarks were accurate because look what a good decision I made to come here, get a chance to see this campus and visit with you all. I'm enriched by it, and I appreciate you inviting me and sharing some of the experiences and the environment with me to help me understand the challenges that you're addressing and the issues that are really important to you. When Randy asked me to come and address you, and especially after I saw the people who had preceded me here, it's really a formidable list of public health experts, and I don't hold myself as a public health expert. And so proceeding on the belief that the best sort of public presentations, the best sort of lectures, are those that not only teach the audience something, but more importantly, perhaps teach the speaker something, I thought it would be important for me to try and crystallize my thoughts around this issue, which has been sort of gnawing at me for a while. What you're seeing this evening is certainly not a finished proposal or finished product. It is certainly a work in progress, but I appreciate the chance to vet it with you all, to have you think about it with me, help me understand better how we as a nation can address something that I think is a significant issue. Now, I must say, my thoughts about this change a little bit given the current environment. A nuclear catastrophe loomed a lot more frightening before the recent economic issues. And now I think maybe that the economy is a bigger problem than a nuclear one. the story of when the Soviet Union was still the Soviet Union, and every May Day they would have these marvelous, huge parades with tanks and soldiers marching and weapons and rockets and airplanes flying over, and these would go on for hours. And the story of the Prime Minister standing there reviewing as these fabulous arms would go past. At the very end of the parade, there was one Jeep, 3 men in suits at the very end. And someone said, "General, what is that?" He says, "Comrade, that's our secret weapon." "What is it? Are these our nuclear experts? Are these our intercontinental ballistic missile physicists?" "No, comrade, these are economists." I think those are the issues that we're facing today. Well, let me share with you first my inability to use. There we are. And I apologize. Those of you in the back of the room, I said this a little earlier, but I will apologize again. The print may be small because I didn't appreciate the length of the room. And so the only thing I can ask you to do is please cover your left eye and tell me the smallest. No. What's the chance of this happening? If it's a very remote chance, then this may be an interesting intellectual exercise, an interesting academic issue for us to discuss, but isn't really a public health issue. And I want to share with you that my appreciation of the likelihood of some sort of a nuclear event is substantially higher than what I had anticipated. These are data from a large and thoughtful group of some 85 experts, arms control, national security, international politicians, who were convened by Senator Lugar, a really thoughtful and I think effective leader on this issue, along with Senator Nunn, to ask the question, what's the risk of a nuclear and also a biologic, but I'm only showing you the nuclear data here, in the next 10 years somewhere in the world. So those are the frames of reference. Now, you can see that a nuclear accident is 15%. Well, that's probably because the nuclear industry is fairly carefully regulated. There are quality control measures in place and some degrees of redundancy. But if you look at the chance of a dirty bomb, 40% somewhere in the world in the next 10 years. A nuclear attack, almost 30%. Any of us who watched what happened between India and Pakistan, or between North Korea and its neighbors, or between Iran and its neighbors, I can understand why these experts think this might happen. Well, there are certainly hot spots all over the world. And certainly in the United States, I think we are at risk of some sort of nuclear mischief, be it of sinister intent by some foreign power or someone trying to destabilize our economy, or just some accident that occurs. So the point is, there's a finite and real chance of this happening. And therefore, if this is true, and if we care about the state of our nation, then what do we have in place to try and address it? There are a lot of different kinds of devices. And I want to express my appreciation to Dr. Norm Coleman, who's in the Department of Health and Human Services, who was kind enough to share some slides with me and to use the nomenclature that the federal government uses for some of these things: improvised nuclear devices, a radiologic dispersal explosive, or a device for simply spraying radiation. A crop duster is shown there. Or simply an exposure device, that is, putting something in a public place that emits radiation. All of these are very, very understandable, very real. Some of them are enormously simple ways of creating a great deal of mischief. There are differences in how the federal government will approach these, and I don't intend to spend very much time on it except just to educate you as I became educated, that in the instance of an explosion that's a nuclear, either contains nuclear material or a nuclear bomb, of course you have an event that's recognizable. Something explodes, it's not secret, and so you'll be able to evaluate and mobilize. Now, the radiation may not be detected immediately because people aren't looking for it immediately. Exactly what the injuries will be and what the risks are will have to be reconstructed by physicists later, looking at how close someone is to the event, how much they were exposed, under what circumstances, and so forth. Now, decontamination will be very important under those circumstances. A second kind of sets of events really are the non-explosive air, food, water, soil. Again, one will be looking at what is the impact of this on the population that's exposed. A third, and all these share some common features, such as the absolute essential need for physicists to tell us what the exposure rate is and how likely it is that someone will suffer some injury. These three areas have a need for acute, timely intervention. But as the biologists in the room will appreciate, there is, of course, long-term damage, and whatever we do in the short term, there must be a complementary effort in the long term to assess the dangers and the predictable toxicities that will occur. We learned this from the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs, and certainly and more recently from Chernobyl. So this is my level of physics. Simple cartoons that talk about, running away from things or getting too close. I have a son-in-law who's a physicist, and he tries to explain these things to me. He wants very much to be a teacher of physics, but I think I try even his vast patience. In looking at those things that are important in the short term, the distance from the blast or the exposure, the duration of the exposure, and the shielding become the three critical elements. And for example, it's possible to look at a building, either a house or a larger building, both above ground and below ground, and to see the amount of shielding that one gets. In the basement even of a house, one may be getting 90% or 95% shielding from a nuclear exposure. And that depending on the kind of building, the construction, and so forth, one may get a very substantial shielding. Of course, there is a rate of decay, and again, not just the biologists, but the physicists in the room understand that. That is, for many isotopes, the longer the duration between the event itself and someone's exposure, the less radiation they may come in contact with. Now, there's some isotopes that last for a frustratingly long time. To set off even a simple, dirty device on Wall Street using the right kind of material could make that part of Manhattan uninhabitable for 5,000 years. And you can imagine how devastating that would be. Or Washington, or Tennessee, or any other locale. So what then are we talking about in terms of, for people who are exposed to radiation, and let's, for the purposes of the discussion tonight, say it's an explosion, because that's dramatic, and it's relatively easier to model than some other kinds of things. And in that sort of an instance, There will sadly be some individuals so close to the blast that either because of the trauma, the wave of the blast, or because of heat, those individuals will perish almost immediately or very, very quickly. And sadly, there's nothing that we can do. It's like someone who's too close to dynamite. All of our modern medicine will not save that individual. But there are a whole range, and it's good to think of this as a spectrum of exposures for which there may be interventions that, if properly applied in a timely fashion, may make a difference. And so think about the range of possibilities that exists. You have some situations where if the radiation is just massive, you will have immediate death, 100% mortality without specialized care, 100% mortality even with the best of care. A person is rushed to the world's best hospital immediately, unable to save that individual. But then there's a whole spectrum, a whole range of other kinds of events. Acute exposure that's serious, weakness, bone marrow nearly or completely destroyed. Radiation injury to human tissue tends to first be visible in those things that have a rapidly dividing cell pool. So there are a lot of bone marrow stem cells that duplicate very, very often and very quickly. Gastrointestinal cells, intestinal lining cells, have that same property. Skin cells have that same property. And so those are the tissues that you might most quickly detect radiation injury. Well, without specialized care, those individuals will die uniformly. But if you have specialized hospital care available, the right doctors, the right facilities, the right infrastructure, the right knowledge, the right medications, you may be able to save 60% of those people. Now, I'm not proud of that fact. I care about the other 40%, of course, but 60% is a substantial number. Now, not surprisingly, there's a next echelon of injuries where there may be internal bleeding, severe nausea and vomiting. Again, mortality without specialized care, uniform. But with specialized care, perhaps only 50% of the people will die. And then there's a more moderate kind of exposure. Hair loss doesn't strike me as a terrible toxicity, but obviously there are those that may be more troubled by it. A much higher risk of infection. Well, perhaps half of those people or more may survive without specialized medical care. It's a severe injury, but it's not a fatal injury. Only a third of those people will die if they're gotten to the proper facility. And then there's a whole range of much more milder. And there, you really don't need any special care necessarily. There will be some deaths, but there'll be many people who will survive even without intensive interventions. And so one of the first challenges that we will have as a nation, as a community, will be the proper triage, the proper evaluation of what the risks are, what the exposure has been, what's the likelihood of benefit. This is a dreadful thing to say, but I fear that it must be something that we consider. There will be those individuals who we will simply have to say, too ill to be helped. You want to give them the maximum support. You want to treat them respectfully. You want to give them every opportunity for comfort. But you may decide, if we have only limited resources, not to commit large investments, precious space, precious medications, precious technologies, scarce technologies to those individuals. This is not a position that I would want to have. Luckily, it's not something that I'm skilled enough to do. It is a terribly difficult problem, but is one that we may have to consider at some point in the future. So that's the general kind of environment that we exist in. There's a time course of radiation effects. And these are the kind of charts I like because they're suitably vague. Within days, central nervous system. Within weeks and months, gastrointestinal and bone marrow. Organ dysfunction, liver toxicity, radiation pneumonitis, inability to breathe properly. Years off, and then perhaps decades later, secondary malignancies. All of these are the sequelae of exposure to radiation. And one of the critical questions we face is, can we intervene effectively once that radiation dose has been given? It's hard to model what this might look like. If we had a nuclear accident, and in the state of California where I live, we do have nuclear plants. One is probably only 50, 60, maybe a little bit more miles away from me, San Onofre. I regularly go to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and 3 Mile Island is right there. So we know that these things exist. If there was a nuclear accident, maybe a mile or more around might be impacted. If it were a dirty bomb, well, certainly half a mile or several blocks, assuming it's a smallish bomb. A nuclear attack might have a much larger distance, and the number of people exposed and the amount of area exposed might be very much larger. Modeled for the purposes of this, perhaps 20-mile radius, the number of certain fatalities, depending upon where the nuclear attack occurred, 100,000 people could easily be killed. And thousands, hundreds of thousands more exposed. The number of people requiring care, again, if you think about the most dire of the circumstances, at least the same number of people as who died immediately. And of those requiring specialized care, well, it's a huge number of people. At the low end, perhaps 100 people. And at the high end, perhaps 30,000 people. Now, this is the point where, because Randy's been waiting for me to say something about public health, this is the point where public health specialists need to engage to think about, well, how do we as a nation prepare for that sort of situation? I could be modeling for you avian flu. I could be modeling for you Ebola or other hemorrhagic fevers. This is not a scenario that is really tied to nuclear as much as it is tied to the world we live in, a larger, more crowded, more mobile world in which things happen and we have almost no control whatsoever. If you had a small contained nuclear event, it might be possible to address it with the facilities that we have currently. If, however, we have a larger event, I believe we would need not just one, but a whole network, an integrated set of facilities to try and deal with the problem. So what is it that I envision? If at the heart of this we need some sort of specialized medical care, yes, you need all these other elements: transportation and logistics management, communication, public works and engineering. I mean, think about damaging a sewer system or a water supply, long-term community recovery, public safety and security. We know that after Katrina, those were huge issues for that natural disaster. Mass medical services for the variety, not just of the people who've been injured, but the people who are worried about being injured. And a priori, you can't tell one from the other, and you'll need to pay attention to both groups and to treat both groups. Energy, agriculture, natural resources, firefighting, search and rescue. Yes, you need an integrated package. I'm not for a moment suggesting that what I'm focusing on solves everything. It does not. But at least from my myopic point of view, at the very heart of this is the medical establishment. It's, you know, there's a South American saying that to a hammer everything looks like a nail. To me, I tend to see the medical system at the center of it, but I understand that if a civil engineer were giving this lecture, he or she might see it entirely differently. So the hypothesis is that any type of nuclear catastrophe will require a highly specialized kind of radiation care. And whether it's an accident or a dirty bomb or nuclear attack, there's some things that we're going to need to have medically. Not in necessarily the order of frequency, but an order of importance, I think. Bone marrow treatments, blood-related services, because if the blood cells are so badly affected, then the body's ability to replicate and to replace cells that are naturally dying, white cells for fighting infection, platelets for blood clotting and coagulation, red blood cells to carry oxygen, those sorts of cellular elements will be needed. Radiologic diagnostics, severe skin burns, multiple injuries, a decontamination environment, infection management, sterile rooms. These are all the things that will be needed in that eventuality. So if you look at some of the quotes from that Lugar report, everybody believes, A, that specialized medical care is critical. Those experts believe that we are, as a nation, woefully underprepared. And the gap between resources and mass casualty surges is so significant. There are many limitations on resources and access to specialized hospital beds. My purpose this evening is not to alarm people, and certainly not to be pessimistic. None of us likes to consider the most dire things that exist in the world. Those of you who are parents in the audience, like me, you worry about what anyone else would say are the silliest things for your children, but to you these are real worries, and you try and put them into some sort of a framework. The fact is, these risks exist, and we as a nation can choose to not pay attention and to hope we get lucky, and we're often very, very lucky, or we can say, what is a rational way of trying to reasonably deal with these risks? One of the options that we might like to have simply doesn't exist. We can't eliminate this risk. There is nothing that we can do that will absolutely for sure eliminate the chance of something bad happening. I wish we could, but of course we can't. So this is the point at which I began to really get worried. Data from the American Hospital Association tells me that in the year 2000, there were about 823,000 beds in the United States. And 7 years later, there are 800,892 beds. Somehow we've lost 23,000 beds. I can tell you in California, I can tell you in Los Angeles, every new hospital that we've built, UCLA, USC County Hospital, every hospital has been smaller than the one it replaced. Why? Well, hospital beds are very expensive. Currently, well, I can't say currently, before the recent economic downturn, the average cost of a hospital bed was about $3 million a bed. So for a 100-bed hospital, and that's not a big hospital, talking about $300 million. Huge amount of money. And we had all kinds of information saying more treatment was going to be given as an outpatient, hospital stays would be shorter, minimally invasive surgery, better drugs, earlier diagnosis, better long-term care. There were many reasons that we believed that we would need fewer hospital beds. I believe it's better for us simply to say we were wrong. Just as I think it's better for us to say we were wrong about trying to guess how many nurses we would need and why nursing schools closed a decade or 2 decades ago, that we now realize, oh my goodness, we have a shortage of nurses. I think physician modeling, medical modeling, has got a very mixed record of success, and that we have been wrong, as we collectively have been wrong more often than we've been right about some of these trends. But the projection is, and this can all change, like the ghost of the future Christmas. This doesn't have to be 738,000 beds. It could be something much larger. But that's the projection at this time. And please note that at the same time, the population of the United States increased from 281 million to 300 million to more than 350 million. So we've got fewer beds, more people, more risk. There seems to be an imbalance here. So if I were to imagine what sort of a facility we would need to help address and care for these patients, it would have the following characteristics, I think. It would have surge capacity. That is, built-in expansion capacity during a crisis. So what am I not suggesting? I'm not suggesting that we build hospitals and leave them empty. That makes no sense. That's a stupid way to do things. Even if we did that, you need to staff it with people, nurses, technicians, radiology techs, pharmacy, physicians, all kinds of people. Where do those people come from? You can't just have an empty shell sitting there for when we need it. That's not what I'm proposing. We need the relevant medical expertise. You really need a deep expertise in treating patients who have compromised immune systems, bone marrow failure, experts in transfusion medicine. You need an environment that's appropriate. Protection against contamination. Patients are very sensitive to infection. You need the most clean and filtered kind of environments. And you'd like this to be in a safe location. It should be close to those areas likely to be impacted, but not too close. You don't want it right in the middle of, give you an example. There are many wonderful hospitals in New York City or in Chicago or in Seattle. They're downtown. And if somebody were to be really sinister and to set off some sort of device, that individual might do it downtown where the greatest amount of havoc could be wreaked. And so having it right in the middle of a location may not be the best thing. The best thing might be just a little bit outside. Convenient access to roads, convenient access to airports, helicopter landing sites, and so forth. That would be the ideal sort of location. Well, there are in the United States a number of very well recognized, highly skilled bone marrow transplant centers where there's real expertise in dealing with patients with bone marrow failure. And yes, these are in areas of larger population density, and these are National Cancer Institute designated centers as part of a special program, and even as a subset of that, the Radiation Injury Treatment Network, organized by the Department of Health and Human Services, has 13 primary and 22 secondary transplant centers that are listed here. And I've been focusing mostly on the West Coast, and there we've got some centers, but a lot of people. Well, as I've suggested, you'll need to have a system that really triages people. Centers that are organized to care for people with acute radiation syndrome or other bone marrow toxic situations. Protocols and treatment guidelines will have to be developed. In the triage center, some people will be sent for further screening. Some people will be recognized to only need general medical care, but some population will need the specialized acute radiation syndrome care. They're so critical, they will die without that special care. But with that special care, at least a proportion of those individuals will live. If any of you have read or remember what happened at Chernobyl, it recreates that situation entirely. Dreadful situation, badly mismanaged at the beginning. People who suffered terrible injuries and then had to be watched as they died because the right resources weren't available at that time. Partly that's historical. We know a little more now than we did then. Partly it's organizational. Partly it's having the right physicians and the right infrastructure. But also partly it's having the will to do what's needed. So this is the point where I got thinking about what we at City of Hope could do. And in the Western United States, there are only 5 transplant centers that are in this system. We do about 1/3 of the bone marrow transplants on the West Coast. We're getting close to having done our 10,000th bone marrow transplant. It's an absolutely phenomenal program. The person who heads up the program, Steve Foreman, and one of your colleagues and I were just talking about him, has pointed out to me that if you accumulate the number of years in toto of all the lives that have been saved, that is, someone who's going to die of leukemia or die of lymphoma, gets a transplant, lives, has a life of some duration. Some of these people are now alive 25 and 30 years later. If you accumulate all that, it's more than 20,000 years. That's more than humans have existed as a species. It's a long time. It's a big deal. I'm very respectful of what they do. And it occurred to me that perhaps what we should do as we're designing our next new patient tower, and we just built a 144-bed hospital, and the day we opened it, it was, you're right, too small. It was the hospital that was designed for a different environment, designed to be able to fit within the budget that we had at that time. But we're already beginning to try and design our next 100 or 150-bed hospital. And what should that hospital look like? Well, I want it to be the best cancer hospital. But I'm thinking if we're going to do this work, is there a larger public health mission that we can try and address at the same time? So, as I've been thinking about this and trying to talk to my faculty, my staff, and my board of directors about this, thinking about the right infrastructure, thinking about the right location, thinking about the right specialty care that was needed and a controlled environment. But also realizing that even if one were to build a hospital, even if we built the hospital here, right next door, it wouldn't deal with the needs of the nation. It would deal with the local needs. That's very important. That's really excellent. But it wouldn't deal with the needs of the nation. And so if one were to do this, what would those circumstances be? And I suggest the right way to think about it is as a demonstration project or as an experiment, to try and design something that would have the following characteristics. Instead of a room, an individual patient room that had ultra-filtered air, silver coating on the ducts to kill microorganisms as they land there, all the things that we have in our hospital, positive pressure rooms to blow germs out of the room, that you could reverse and make negative pressure rooms in case you're dealing with avian flu or something like that. I can design that, not me, but people can design that for me, and we can have a very nice 100-bed hospital. But it occurred to me that if we design the rooms slightly differently, a little bit larger, instead of having one set of ICU type gauges, gases, abilities, you simply double that, and within each room you have 2 sets of all the things that you need: the oxygen, the suction, the electric monitoring, all the specialty care. Then in the event of some catastrophe, one could simply say, you know what, we're going to divide the room in half. Not going to be as luxurious as it was, not going to be as elegant as it was. It's going to be a little bit crowded, but dude, this is a crisis. This is an emergency. And we would be able to immediately take care of a couple of 100 patients. Now, we don't have the luxury of sending our patients away, so it's not as though someone comes in with a less critical breast cancer. I'm going to have patients in the hospital. But if I can squeeze out 100 or 200 extra beds, given the expertise that we have existing on our campus, it might provide a way of thinking about this. Again, not to solve the West Coast problem, but to act as a set of hypothesis testing structure, if you will. And the idea then would be, as a demonstration project, to say, what other parts of the United States want to look at this? Here's our plans, take them. You can design it. We will make some mistakes, without a doubt. We'll have some errors. We won't have thought of certain things. But the next generation of building can be better. And the generation after that can be even better. And pretty soon our facility will be obsolete, but that's okay, because in medicine and medical facilities, it's worse than computer equipment. I mean, things get obsolete so quickly, and you can't imagine what's going to be just around the corner. And so it occurred to us that this might be a way of thinking about how to address a national issue with a local problem. I was speaking with someone earlier this evening, and they said, who's responsible for fixing this? And the answer is, from my years in Washington, nobody's responsible. The Department of Defense has one set of concerns, Health and Human Services, FEMA. Everybody has some role, but nobody has the vision. Nobody has the authority. Nobody has the leadership to say, and here's how we should fix it. We haven't done it for anthrax. We haven't done it for radiation. We haven't done it for a lot of things. So what are the options? We can complain. We can drink. Or we can try and come up with solutions that the government, and it may be state government, it may be national government, looks to as a model for solution. I hope nobody here hears me being partisan or parochial about this. I am absolutely not. This is not, it's not like one political party is good and one political party is bad. I think both political parties have ignored this. I think it's a hard issue. I'm not blaming anybody, but I'm simply saying we as citizens have the opportunity to think about what I consider to be a really grand, serious, important public health issue. And while I don't have a solution for you all this evening, I thought it entirely appropriate, given this venue, given the perspective that you all are taking, that this is the sort of public health debate, public health discussion that might be fruitfully engaged in. So the City of Hope model, and we're less than 10 miles east of Pasadena, sort of north of Los Angeles, but just we're a suburb of Los Angeles essentially, near 3 very large airports, near 2 very large freeways, but nobody is going to think of having any kind of nuclear event in Duarte, California. I promise you. It's just not anywhere on the map. So we're more than 20 miles from a potential blast area. We now have 120 acres of property. We have this highly sophisticated hospital system, information systems that we have. We're just finishing off a 40,000 square foot transfusion medicine building that it should be open a month from today. We're opening it. And I couldn't be more excited. It's a beautiful building. To think about designing a new hospital tower that has a surge capacity for 2 or 3 patients per room. Yeah, we're going to have to think about triaging. We're going to have to think about how to deal with all the kinds of patients. But we have a very large experience dealing with immune-compromised patients. And we really have all the research to think about doing that. If one thinks about the whole range federally of what this looks like, because I'm talking about just dealing with a small fraction of that, it really is all these issues The acute issues, the longer term issues, mental health, nursing home care, boy, those are significant issues. Absolutely important issues. City of Hope is an expert in that. We're good at dealing with the spiritual needs of cancer patients, but dealing with sort of mass concerns that would occur after something like this, we're probably not the best equipped to deal with that. But we will need federal and we will need local organizations involved. So what then are the take-home messages from a federal point of view? The federal government believes that these sorts of preparations are part of an all-hazards approach, whether it's a toxin, whether it's a virus or a bacteria, whether it's a natural event, whether it's a man-made event, and including their medical response to radiation-related events is part of that. Now, I've had this discussion with some of the leaders, and they think this is a really good idea, but they don't know how to go about implementing something on a national scale. Oh, that's too much money. It's too complicated. There are too many jurisdictions. There are too many conflicting agendas. And so I understand that. That is the political reality in Washington. But we can't let that sort of stop us. We really need to come up not only with better systems for dealing with these situations, we need to deal with a more orderly kind of way of evaluating patient, algorithm-based approaches, and better physics to understand what the actual exposure is. Emergency response will depend upon what people are exposed to. A lot of very interesting physics, biophysics, the dosimetry, and radiation therapy is really an important component here because it's the radiation physicists who actually understand some of the biologic features as well as the physical features that are involved. We don't really have very many medical countermeasures right now. We have some things like iodine, and what that's going to do is keep you from having a thyroid cancer 10 years or 15 or 20 years later. That's important, but it's not a big deal. We do have growth factors for blood cells. That's nice. But on the other hand, there are lots of things we don't have. We don't have vascular repair mechanisms. We don't have lung, pulmonary repair mechanisms. We don't have a lot gastrointestinal repair mechanisms. And perhaps we need to think about how to do that. There is a dual-use technology here. Not only would it be good for this, it would be very good for the cancer patients that I care about who, when they get radiation, suffer the side effects of that radiation on their gut, on their lungs, on their heart, on the vascular system. And so if we could devise these sorts of things, it does have a significance that I could imagine. It's a sort of self-evident truism that close collaboration will be essential between all the parts of the government and between the federal government and the state and local authorities and between academia, which really doesn't have any particular linkage to this, and to federal agencies, because I do think that academia is a place where many of these solutions can be thought about and many of these problems solved. And there's a role for industry in making these things available, both in terms of research, development, and of course in terms of marketing. So if I haven't completely depressed you, and I hope I haven't, because it wasn't my intent, and I worry about that actually as I talk about this, because I don't want this to seem, there's a certain level of you want people to be concerned and you don't want them to be paralyzed or fearful, because that doesn't lead to anything useful. But I do think this is a valuable debate, a valuable discussion for us to have. And while I understand this is probably not the sort of discussion that others who will come here and deal with really elegant topics, whether it's AIDS or other infectious diseases, whether it's general epidemiology of obesity or hypertension, whether it's climate and other concerns there, Those are very important, crucial, meaningful sorts of public health discussions to have. I hope that in some small way this fits in with that. So let me stop my remarks at that point. I'd be more than happy to have people in the audience offer comments or questions that we can possibly deal with. It's a real pleasure to be here and to have the chance to meet you all and address you this evening. And I'm very grateful to Randy for his kind hospitality. So questions or comments, please.
Mike, let me challenge you a little bit. A number of years ago, I used to give a talk called Medical Effects of Nuclear War. And then, having been involved with the tsunami and with Katrina, I've come to believe that there's a 3 to 5 to 7 day window when the system simply won't function. There's no EMS system to get people from Los Angeles to Duarte. How do you envision, I mean, because what you're talking about is time critical. How do you envision that working if the system isn't functioning?
You know, if you think about the details that will have to be worked out, it quickly becomes very overwhelming, because how will you rationally care for all those people? How you make decisions about who needs to be medevaced, because almost surely you won't have the ability to care for those individuals locally. The current plan, though, that the government has is to air vac people. So you can say, well, but so they've already considered how to do it. I think that rather than preparing for single events, I think what you do is you set up categorical solutions, and you say, if avian flu broke out in Los Angeles, what would we do? Well, the same thing is we have to think about what would we do if there was a nuclear accident at San Onofre, or someone just blew up a building. I mean, or someone just blew up a building. I mean, what we don't have are those general reflexes. And that's what we need to have. Now, I think all of us are a little appalled at what happened at Katrina. And I think we've all learned a lot about how one can do a better job. Actually, I'm going to go off on a tangent for just a second and say, one of the things that I hope our new Surgeon General does, and I don't know who that individual is going to be, the Commission Corps, the Public Health Service, is a great resource that has been let go. It's a bunch of people wearing uniforms, and I proudly wore the uniform for 18 years, and so I can talk like this. There's a great opportunity there for public health officers, physicians, nurses, pharmacists, all kinds of people, to use that as a sort of flying squad to deal with those critical needs. And I hope the new administration, I can tell you the last several administrations, again, this is not partisan, nobody's done this right, has recognized the incredible power that the public health service has, and certainly hasn't harnessed that power. To have a cadre of people that are very skilled, able to jump in, able to deal with these crises, would be a hugely powerful thing. We just don't have it right now. That was a paid political. Other questions or comments, please?
Ken Silver, Environmental Health. Thank you for a stimulating talk. First up, a friend of mine got a stem cell treatment for his multiple myeloma at your fine institution. Put 3 years on his life that he otherwise wouldn't have had. So thanks.
Thank you.
In the summer of 2002, when the alleged dirty bomber was apprehended, it was all over the political talk shows, and one of our leaders was quoted as saying, you know, if that scenario played out, we might have to relax our public health standards for exposure to low-level radiation. Simply make a political risk management decision that it's impossible to comply with current standards. We might have to relax them. And that bothered me.
My children have asked me to do the same thing frequently, I have to tell you.
As distinguished from a waiver to the existing standards. This is a political leader. Anything hops into his head, he says it. He's now our vice president. Hopefully he'd be on a shorter leash if it happens soon. But what disturbed me is that I know something about the current scientific basis for our existing radiation standards for low-level exposure. And they're mostly based upon the long-term epidemiologic studies of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the cohort was not established until 5 years after the blast. And there's a big school of thought that all of those observations are really observations on our survivor cohort. Epidemiologist Alice Stewart devoted her career to pointing out the susceptibles who were probably lost in the 5 years before the cohort was established. So I heard you mention exposure assessment for the purpose of triaging the people who had high-level exposure or symptomatic for the allocation of medical resources. That makes sense. But many of the folks here, even on a good day, don't get to boss doctors and nurses around. We're trained to do epidemiology and work with communities. Has anyone thought about very rapidly enumerating the cohort of asymptomatic people who had low-level exposures so that we can do better epidemiology for how much low-level radiation is harmful?
The short answer is yes. There's a lot of, not a lot, there's some cell biology research that's being conducted looking at what are the markers of radiation injury that are so subtle that they would only be picked up at with the most elegant kinds of techniques. And once you identify those, what are the significances of them? And this is not an area of expertise of mine. I can tell you that there's some investment being made in it. And I think it's important to do that work. It will become even more important when we have actual remedies or palliatives to offer. Then it becomes even more meaningful to be able to identify it. It's a valid concern that you're raising. And the answer is the science doesn't exist right now to effectively, rapidly, economically do that.
Ed Kelly, thank you for a wonderful talk. On the issue of a nuclear attack and radiation, given Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but also given non-nuclear attacks, the firebombing in Dresden, the firebombing in Tokyo, and given the likelihood that if there is a nuclear attack, it won't be one nuclear attack in one place, it'll be a number of nuclear attacks, and that the medical community isn't just going to be facing 500, 600, 700 people coming to the facility with various states of radiation, but also people with burns, people with, they could be in the tens or 50, 60,000 people trying to get in. How do we talk about the people that you're talking about, those 100% in triage? We may have to invent a new word for triage if we end up in that kind of a situation.
Well, I think your concerns are very appropriate, and people do recognize that the magnitude of such an event might be very, very large. This quickly spirals down into where you sort of shrug your shoulders and throw your hands up and say, well, then we can't do anything. And that, even though I'm an internist, that doesn't appeal to me very much. And so I want to say, well, let's figure out what we can fix and not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Now, we need to have available large-scale trauma type, and luckily here the military is a wonderful model. We do have MASH facilities, the equivalent of what today are MASH facilities. They can be set up quickly, they can handle trauma. They're fabulous. They really are very good. There'll be a lot of people that could be helped under that circumstance. It's not a perfect, and you say, well, wait a minute, where are those people going to come from? Where do you get, you can't take all the doctors away from Walter Reed and the National Naval Medical Center or local facilities, but there are models of looking at that, and I think that will be part of it. This image of a mosaic or a jigsaw puzzle, I really think is the right one, and you have all the pieces, and what you have to hope is that there's someone in charge who has both the coolness of thinking and the decisiveness to say, well, here's the problem, and here's what we have as potential solutions, and here's how they're going to match up, and undoubtedly we're going to be ill-prepared, undoubtedly. But hopefully we'll be less ill-prepared than we would have been otherwise. I know that's scant comfort. And if you're like me, you just think, I just hope it doesn't happen in my lifetime or my children's lifetime. And it's a stupid, magical thinking, but that's what I engage in. Please.
Yes, I served on a nuclear missile launch crew during the...
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing.
I said I've served on a nuclear missile launch crew during the Vietnam War. We controlled more destructive capability and 4 missiles than all the conventional bombs dropped in World War II. The point I'm trying to point out, at that time we had roughly 50,000 nuclear weapons between Russia, the Soviet Union, and the United States. We still have 2,500 on the USA side deployed, according to agreement. Somebody may be cheating on the agreement. And Russia has 2,500. And a year or so ago, Bush seemed to forget that, and Putin had to remind him, we still have the missiles. But I find an incredible amount of indifference and apathy on the part of the American public as to the ability of one mistake and under mutually assured destruction in casting this world back into either the Stone Age or completely annihilating mankind.
Well, it's a valid point, and I give a lot of credit to people like Sam Nunn and others who have really addressed this in their own quiet, effective way and have pushed for certain sorts of remedies, things that weren't very popular. For example, paying the Russians to destroy their nuclear missile. People say, oh, why should we give money to the Russians? The answer is to get rid of the nuclear missiles. And I'm not saying that's a perfect plan or it's the way to solve things, but you need leaders who really rivet our attention and call on the better angels of our nature to do the right thing. Your concern is valid. Well, is that...
Mike, thank you very much.
No, let me thank you all very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
But Mike, we have some parting gifts. And I'd like to... You were probably wondering what all these things down here were.
Actually, I hadn't looked. I was afraid that I had lost my bag yesterday, so he probably bought me a shirt because I was afraid that...
Now, first of all, we're very pleased
Oh, that's lovely.
to give you the status of honorary professor in the College of Public Health.
Wow.
And-
This is lovely. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
You could be the first person in Duarte to have one.
Listen, this is actually very nice. Thank you.
Now,
Very
we've
kind of
got a
you.
couple of gifts here we're not going to unwrap right now. This is an encyclopedia of Appalachia, everything that you wanted to know about living in the real part of the country.
Is this part of the exercise philosophies that he's been trying to? This is a weighty tome, I got to tell you.
This is your very own College of Public Health mug. When you open it up, you'll appreciate it even more. But we have quite seriously a gift for you that was handmade by Linda Gallagher in the third row there. When we first started
Thank
this
you.
series, we said, what's something that's really symbolic of Appalachia? And Linda came up with the idea of a handmade art quilt. Quilts, of course, reflect one of the things we're very proud of about Appalachia, which is we don't have a lot, but we make something really good out of what we have. And Linda has made a really beautiful quilt for you here. And
while he's opening this, let me tell you, it turns out that my wife, who is also a physician, but she's smarter than me because she retired, and it's like yelling shotgun. You know, if you do it first, you get to sit in the front seat of the car. Well, she yelled retirement first, and so it shows she's smarter than me. She's a weaver and a quilter, and oh, this is lovely. Isn't that fabulous? And we have a quilt collection at home. From the early 1800s in terms of woven coverlets, but also some quilts. And so this is really so thoughtful. Thank you so much.
In honor of your talk, it's called Fire on the Mountain, and on the back it says, presented to Michael A.
Oh,
Friedman.
that is lovely.
That's you, and with your title.
Oh, that's really so thoughtful. Thank you very, very much. I know how much work it takes. No, I do. I can't do it, but I understand. I've watched my wife on many occasions, and thank you. That's so kind of you. Thank you very much. Wonderful. Thank you.
And let me just remind you that next month we have 2 lectures in the lecture series. On March 5th, we have Nicole Lurie talking about health disparities.
And she's terrific. You're going to love her.
The one
Seriously.
we bring in is terrific.
No, she's great.
On March 26th, we have Al Gore talking about the health effects, climate change and health effects. Please, obviously, encourage folks to come to both of them. Look forward to seeing you on the 5th. Take a moment and look at the exhibit in the back, Against the Odds, from the National Library of Medicine. And then one more round of applause for Dr.
Thank you.